should say,
I would be very uncomfortable starting with the social programs without the growth. And that's the sort of conversation that I often see happening in Silicon Valley, where we start with UBI,
right?
Because we're lying about automation. If automation is happening, then we'll see it in the productivity numbers, and then eventually maybe we need something like UBI. If automation is not happening and you do UBI, then you just blow up the economy.
Right. I should say, and you've come
sort of a question.
You've come somewhat towards
doing them in parallel.
Yeah,
I'm okay with that.
No.
I'm not okay with starting with the socialism.
Well, so I appreciate
even a Marxist wouldn't believe this. Even a Marxist thinks you have to first get the capitalists to do things before you can redistribute stuff.
Right, I know.
And you can't start with the redistribution before we've done the automation.
I'm not even a Marxist, Peter. But the thing that I was going to say is that as you talk about the fact that we can solve some of these problems socially, I want to talk about from the progressive side. I'm not interested in using social programs where markets continue to function. I mean, the idea of making people personally accountable for their own happiness and their own success and path through the world is incredibly liberating. And I view markets as providing most of the progress that we now enjoy. So there is something that's very weird and punitive about the desire for redistribution. I mean, there's almost a desire to tag the wealthy that has nothing to do with taking care of the unfortunate. And what I really am talking about here is how do we get a conversation between left and right, which isn't cryptic, which isn't,
of course, I have a much more cynical view of this, where I think the redistribution rhetoric, it's mainly not even targeted at the wealthy.
Oh, it's targeted
at the lower middle class, at the deplorables, or whatever you want to call them. And it's a way to tell them that they will never get ahead, nothing will happen in their life, and that's actually why a lot of people who are lower middle class or middle class are viscerally quite strongly opposed to welfare, because it's always an insult to them. It's always heard as an insult, and I'm not sure they're wrong to feel that.
Well, and I feel that a lot of the talk about redistribution is actually families of high 8 through 11 figures trying to figure out how to target families of 6-figure through low 8-figure wealth as the targets of the redistribution, that the very wealthy will be able to shelter assets and protect themselves, or maybe even switch nations, whereas people who are dentists and orthodontists and accountants are going to be the ones viewed as the rich, who are going to be incapable of getting themselves out of the way. So I think that partially what good faith conversation between left and right opens up is that we have a shared interest in uncovering all of the schemes of the people who enjoy pushing around pieces of paper and giving speeches in order to engineer society for their own reasons.
Yeah, so one way I would restate what you just said,
sure,
would be that redistribution from the powerful to the powerless, from the rich to the poor, is like from the powerful to the powerless. And so you're using power to go after those with power. And that's almost oxymoronic. It's almost self-contradictory. And so there may be some way to do that. I think most of the time you end up with some fake redistribution, some sort of complicated shell game of one sort or another.
Right.
And the varying, I know the causation of this stuff is much, much trickier, but if we look at societies that are, somehow further to the left on some scale,
right.
The inequality, you have to go really far to the left before, and maybe just destroy the whole society before you really start solving, the inequality problem. California, when I first moved here as a kid in 1977, would have been sort of a centrist state in the U.S. politically, and was broadly middle class. Today, California is the second most democratic state. It's a D+30 state. It's super unequal. And at least on a correlated basis, not causation, but at least on a correlated basis, the further to the left it's gone, the more unequal it's become. And there is something pretty weird about that.
There is. Something that sort of fits in here is that, in part, I've learned from you, and you can tell me whether you recognize it in this formulation or not, is start with any appealing social idea. That's step one. Step two, ask what is the absolute minimal level of violence and coercion that would be necessary to accomplish that idea. Now add that to the original idea. Do you still find your original idea attractive? And that this flips many of these propositions into territory where I suddenly realize that something that people see as being very attractive actually can only be accomplished with so much misery, even if it's done maximally efficiently, that it's no longer a good idea. And I think that this has been very influential in my thinking. And what I've
look, the visceral problem with communism is not its redistributive tendencies. It's the extreme violence. It's that you have to kill tons of people. There's always one of the professors I studied under at Stanford, René Girard, was a sort of great philosophical, sociological, anthropological thinker, and he had this observation that he thought communism among Western intellectuals became unfashionable. You could date it to the year 1953, the year Stalin died, and the reason was they were not communist in spite of the millions of people being killed. They were communist because of the millions of people that were being killed. As long as you were willing to kill millions of people, that was a sign that you were building the utopia. You were building a great new society. And when you stopped, it was just going to be like the lethargy of the Brezhnev era or something like that. And that was not inspiring. I mean, people shifted from Stalin to Mao or Castro, but the violence was charismatic.
I think
very charismatic. And but then also, if you think about it, it's very undesirable.
I think that it's so fascinating that we actually finally get to something like this. I think that is a correct description of part of the communist movement, but not all of the communist movement. There were a lot of people, I think, just my own family was certainly involved in far left politics, and some of it probably dipped into communism. What my sense of it is that there was a period in the 30s where people realized that there had to be coordinated social action and that there were people who were too vulnerable. And that somehow got wrapped up in all of the things that Stalin was talking about that sounded positive if you didn't know the reality. So, for example, Paul Robeson, a hero of the left, was extolling Stalin's virtues openly. My guess is that he didn't fully understand what had happened, that he had gotten involved in an earlier era, and that as things became known and progressed, there was a point at which many people suddenly opened their eyes and said, I've been making excuses for the Soviet Union because at least it had the hope. I mean, there were American blacks, for example, who moved to Moscow because of the hope that it was going to be a racially more equal society. My own family, I would say, was talking about, interracial marriage and open support of homosexuality, female access to birth control. Those things were associated with the Communist Party. And a lot of those ideas are now commonplace, but we forget that, once upon a time, only the communists were willing to dance with these things.
Yes, I don't want to make this too ad hominem, but I want to say that people like your family were likely very intelligent people, but were somehow still always the useful idiots. And there was no country where the communists actually came to power where people like those in your family actually got to make the decisions.
No, I think,
and somehow, like maybe there were indirect ways that it was helpful or beneficial in countries that did not become communist, but in countries that actually became communist, it didn't actually ever seem to work out for those people.
I definitely think that there was some sense that they were fooled and duped in this situation. But by the same token, not wanting to make this too ad hominem, as a gay man, I think that a lot of your rights would have been seen much earlier by the communists who were earlier to that party. I think that to an extent, some of the things that we just take for granted as part of living in a tolerant society were really not found outside. And so if you were trying to dine a la carte, Maybe you could take something from the commie buffet, you could take something from the anti-communist buffet, and you could steal a little from regular party politics. Of course, the Dixiecrats were not exactly the most racially progressive group in the world. Things were very different, and there was no clear place to turn.
Yeah, it's always easy for us to judge people in the past too harshly. So I think that's a good generalization. I would say that that there's something about the revolution, the extreme revolutionary movements that always seem to be, from my point of view, the violence was always too much.
Well, and I would,
and it's a package deal, but I don't like the violence part of the package, and that's the part that at the end of the day makes me think the package would not have been worth it.